right. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar, Climate Change and Georgia's Forests. My name is Ellen Montgomery. I'm the Public Lands Campaign Director with Environment America and Environment Georgia. And I'm really happy to be joined today by Dr. Geer and Dr. Davis with the Dogwood Alliance. So for this webinar, we're going to do a few brief presentations, and then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. So if you navigate down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see what looks like two little speech bubbles and the word or the letters Q and A. If you have questions at any point throughout the webinar, please drop them into the Q&A box and we'll answer them at the end during the question and answer session. And anything that we're not able to answer live on the webinar, we will find out the answer if we can and follow up with you offline. So I want to turn it over to Caroline Griffiths, who's an intern with Environment Georgia, to start us off with a land acknowledgement.
Hi, everybody. So we just wanted to acknowledge the Indigenous history of the state of Georgia, recognize the Georgia tribe of the Eastern Cherokee and the Lower Muskogee Creek tribe. We acknowledge and honor the legacy of Indigenous relationships with the old growth forest in Georgia. Many imagine old growth as a lack of human intervention in a forest, but this attitude discounts both Indigenous and natural histories of these landscapes. With full knowledge of the way European settlers frequently removed the original inhabitants from the land and embarked on widespread forest destruction, we embrace our responsibility to both recognize and rectify these past injustices.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you.
So again, I'm Ellen, go by Len Montgomery. I'm the Public Lands Campaign Director for Environment Georgia and Environment America. And I also work with the coordinating group of the Climate Forest Campaign, which is a national coalition of over 100 organizations across the country working to protect our forests. So I'm going to start with a brief overview and sort of big picture of what we're trying to protect before I turn it over to my Georgia experts here. So you've probably heard of an old growth forest, but what does that mean? So when we're talking about old growth forests, which is what the Climate Forest Campaign is working to protect and restore, we are talking about a diversity of tree species, sizes, and ages, forests that have standing and down dead trees, a diversity of understory plants and healthy soil, and habitat for insects, birds, and other wildlife of all different types of species. Old growth is wild and messy. I love this slide because you can see how these forests are not neat. They're growing at all sorts of weird angles. There's fallen trees, there's fungi, there's all kinds of things growing, and natural forests are really dynamic. Disturbances are always changing things, whether it's fires or droughts or insects or other things. So the processes are continually evolving. It takes in most forests, it takes more than 100 years, in some cases a lot more than 100 years to achieve this. And there aren't very many forests or areas left in the United States that are more than 100 years old. And when I say not very many, I mean really a teeny tiny percentage. And so our campaign is not just focused on protecting existing old growth, but it's focused on recovering what was lost. And so I think that's one of the things we'll focus on today is how do we get Georgia's forests back to what they once were, to actually being forests, and you'll hear more about that. This is an example of a plantation. So sometimes you'll hear that forests are being replanted, but unfortunately replanting often results in what you'd call a plantation or a tree farm, not a functional ecosystem. If you've got a bunch of trees that are the same species and the same age, all standing there, that's not the same kind of conditions as that old growth that I showed you just a minute ago. So why do we want to protect these? In addition to me loving how messy they look, recovering mature and old growth forests is actually a climate solution. So older, bigger trees capture and store more carbon. And bottom line, this is a cheap and efficient carbon capture technology that we don't have to invent. We just have to let the trees grow. So in addition to helping slow climate change, they also help us adapt to climate change, safeguarding biodiversity. A functional forest will reduce flooding and erosion risk. They increase the availability of drinking water for communities. Millions of Americans get their drinking water filtered through forests. And then having features that are more resistant to fire. And then there are many other benefits that our older forests bring us. So cultural use, outdoor recreation, and mental and spiritual well-being. So a quick overview of what's been happening on the national level with some of our federal forest land before we dive into the specifics of Georgia. On Earth Day 2022, President Biden issued an executive order. It was a huge step forward. His executive order on forests directs federal agencies to define, inventory, and create policies that will protect these forests. It's particularly notable that it included protection for mature forests, which we've never seen before. It included Bureau of Land Management land. Those are mostly in the West, but Bureau of Land Management forests. And the biggest deal of all, it talked about older forests as a climate solution. But this is just a step forward. It's not a rule. It's not a law. We still need something durable, but it's a really good start. Next, Secretary Vilsack, the Secretary of U.S. Department of Agriculture that houses the Forest Service, issued a secretarial memo. This had some good, but a little bad in it as well. It acknowledges that America's forests capture more than 10% of our nation's carbon emissions each year, and acknowledge the other benefits, but also says that a primary threat to old growth stands on national forests is no longer timber harvesting. So the Forest Service and USDA don't believe that timber harvesting is a threat or a major threat to our old growth and mature forests. We disagree. We think it's a threat, and it's a threat that we have a lot of control over. We can literally decide whether to log or not. That's the thing that we have the most control over, out of all of our threats. Or all the threats that we face. So then there was a public comment period in August where environmental groups submitted more than 120,000 public comments to the Forest Service saying, these trees and forests are incredibly important. We want you to protect them from logging. And what's next? We're continuing on the national level to call on the USDA and Department of Interior to quickly develop a policy to protect our most valuable trees from threats, including logging. And we want that to, stand as a global model for forest protection. So that's a little bit about what's happening on the national level. The reason that we're doing this webinar, and we've done several others like it, is that there are as many different, forest ecosystems and threats as there are probably states in the country, since so many of our states actually have multiple types of forest ecosystems. And so we want to dive into the particular threats to our forests in the Southeast and in Georgia, hear a little bit about what's going on and what we can do to protect our forests here. So I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over to Dr. Geer to share some of that with us.
All right. Thank you for that introduction. I'm sorry. Let me go to view.
I think it's under slideshow.
Yeah, which I can't see.
It
Hold
is
on.
1, 2, 3, 4. 5 from the right on the menu.
All right. Well, I'm gonna tell you what I'm gonna do. Give me a second. This is a quick fix. I'm gonna stop sharing. Now I'm an educator and this is sad, so hey, it's gonna be all right. Okay. All right. Well, first of all, I'll just talk about threats to Georgia. I learned that you never let technology stop you. It can slow you down, but you keep moving. And slideshow. Okay, here we go. Yay, cool beans. So today we're going to talk about threats to Georgia's forests. I'll tell you this, and I'm going to start off, and then Dr. Davis is going to take it away. But I'll tell you, Georgia's forests, I'm telling you, instead of, we are considered the peach state, but we could be the tree state because we take great pride in our forests, in the fact that we tout that we are #1 for the timber industry. We have about 24 million acres of forest that cover Georgia. However, most of that land is privately owned. And we do lots of exports of wood. We're probably one of the top wood fuel exporters. As far as you can see a lumber industry in most of our rural towns, specifically, you know, from wood pallets to any other type of wood pulp. So you can see that all throughout South Georgia, and that's where I'm based at. So it's very common to see this. But we do, and we have pine trees everywhere. Sometimes I wonder, why is our state tree the great oak? Why is it not the pine tree? So that's quite interesting. So I'll talk about what Georgia's forest does for the people, because that's something that's common. I'm saying it, and just in South Georgia, you can go out your house, there's trees. Most places, you go out into the country land, into the rural areas, you see those trees. But just like you were talking about at the beginning, Lynn, it's critical for our cleaning our water, providing a habitat for all types of biodiverse species that Dr. Davis will talk about, and just protecting our communities from flooding and other catastrophes. And so those forests are critical. So not only are they beautiful to look at and nice for recreation, because that's like a $67 billion industry in Georgia. Just the value of our forests and the recreation that can go on there is major. You know, in our parks and recreation, being able to just be out there in the forest, in nature, seeing all the different things that are going on there and the biodiversity that exists. But the big question is, what's really going on with Georgia's forest? Even though we're so super proud of it, what's happening to it? So as we look we look at the past decade from 2001 to 2021, we've lost about 402,814 acres of forest per year. Now, we got 24 million acres. Somebody might not think that's a whole lot, but that is over a 20-year period. Then we have 8.5 million acres of forest have been lost within that same period. All right. So what's going on? That's a 35% loss of tree cover. What are we doing to our forests? Because our forests protect us, just like Lynn stated. They sequester a great deal of carbon, especially our old growth forests. And we don't have that many old growth forests in Georgia, and you will talk about that, because just how some of our conservation management allows the trees to be cut every 20 years or so. And that's not a mature tree, that's a baby tree. It's not even fully ready to do all that it can. So the big question is, what's happening? Well, just like she mentioned, logging is a big deal. I'll tell you this, if you get at certain parts of Georgia, especially the southern region, I call it the pathway to the ports. You can drive and you will start to see our trees going missing at a great rate. And it's, you know, they're harvesting our southern forest 4 times the rate of the Amazon rainforest, but you will have to see it to believe it. Because if you're in an area where there are trees, just start driving. The closer you get to the ports, the closer you get to some of those wood industries that are closer to the ports, the less trees you begin to see. And this is a real shot taken from Highway 84, Highway 82, east in South Georgia. Lots of trees missing. You see lots of these logging trucks as well. That's very common to see these logging trucks. I'm saying it's like, wow. And then the other industry that's starting to be seen more in Georgia, of course, you have the paper industries and the reasons that we use wood and the reason our timber is used for different things, toilet paper, paper napkins. But another big industry is the wood pellet industry. And it is I would say it is a beast to our southern forests. And in Georgia, we currently have 5 wood pellet plants that are producing about 1.8 million tons of wood pellets per year. That's a lot of trees that are needed for this operation. Here you can see one plant where you just see logs, plenty of logs just laying here. These are those wood pellets here. And then you see a lot of ground up wood that's going to be turned into pellets. That's a huge operation. Those pellets are not being used in our country, are being shipped to Europe and used for fuel, because for some reason they said that there was 0 carbon emissions, but the logging operation in itself accounts for a large amount of emissions. And then the fact that we're going to be sending our trees off to Europe and be burned and to replace coal is even a bigger issue, because our trees are a solution and it should not be the cause of pollution. So what we're going to look at, so this is just an example where those trees are going. I'll also show you where those biomass industries are sourcing, where they're getting their trees from all these regions. Georgia is one of them. So we have 5 pellet plants here right now, 3 are proposed, but these sourcing regions are overlapping each other. And that's a major issue. The sourcing region can be 60 miles. So we get potential. We're seeing our trees go missing, but because we've taken them for granted for so long, you don't realize it until you begin to drive, visit, and see some different things and to see what's going on around us. So that is a major issue. And another thing, I just have to note this, because of the placement of these woody biomass plants that are starting to just, come in and assault our trees and harvest our trees up. It's a major thing that we're seeing. There's a pattern. These industries are also in what we call our environmental justice communities. And these are communities that have at least 25% people of color. And that's individuals who are Black or brown in these areas. And then that causes excess amount of pollution, as well as taking these trees away that are actually helping be part of the solution and sequester carbon. We're creating there's lots of pollution being created in these communities where these pellet plants are sitting. So having said that, to give you a good overview of what's going on in Georgia with our 24 million acres that are currently under threat to different industries of logging being a solution, I'm going to pass it on over to Dr. Davis to tell you what does all this mean for Georgia's forests, and pretty much what does it mean for Georgia's people and the bigger climate crisis that we're facing.
Thanks, Treva. Before this webinar was starting, I was telling Len that I have a deep distrust of where to find the share button on PowerPoint and Google Slides, because it's different. And I can never tell. And I actually wrote it on a Post-it note. You can't see it, but that's the only reason that I know exactly where I need to go to continue the slideshow. So, hi, I'm Sam. I've been with Dogwood Alliance for about 7 years. I wanted to take a second and acknowledge that I tend to work at the regional level. And what that means is I have mostly scaled data down and search stuff specifically for Georgia here, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of my data are Georgia specific, and for that, I apologize. If you have a specific Georgia or even smaller county level number that you want me to find, I will do that for you, participants. All right, so what does this all mean for Georgia's forests? It means that essentially our forests are limping along, right? Like they're not as vibrant, as lush, as wonderful as we would like them to be. And this isn't new either, although certainly the rate and scale of logging over the last 50 years has increased. But this image is always striking to me. So this is a map of virgin forest, problematic term, not my term, but we'll use it for now. So virgin forest just means this concept that, you know, European settlers haven't come in and clear cut it. So in 1620, the eastern US was almost entirely forested. By 1850, industrialization had started and we started clearing out all this stuff. And you can kind of see up in the northern part of New York, we have a little bit of the Adirondacks left, and that is the largest swath of old growth left in the eastern US right now, in the Adirondacks. But all the rest of it started to go away. And by 1926, we had lost 2/3 of our forests, and we really have not gained that forest back. And so again, there are pockets, like we have the Adirondacks pocket up here, and then we have a little bit of pocket in the Blue Ridge, and kind of around the Appalachians. It basically, if it was too hard for people to cut, they would cut easier stuff instead. And that's the only way that old growth survived at all in the eastern US. Also in the western US, those mountains are bigger though, because they're younger. So, you know, we have this habit of just, you know, cutting down the beautiful forest. And since the 1950s, we have even industrialized forests, right? And so now we have this pattern where if I walked into, say, a middle school and I asked a room full of kids, like, how old can a tree get? Well, I don't know what they're going to tell me because middle schoolers are a little crazy sometimes, but I assume that they're going to tell me that a tree can get like hundreds of years old, right? So why in the southern US then are over half of our trees less than 40 years old? It's because of logging. Only 7% of trees in the southern US are older than 80 years. This is Forest Service data without diving too much into detail. It can be problematic in smaller regions, but across the southern US, it's a pretty solid pattern. So those numbers are for the southern US. And then what I did was made a very bad edit here to give you Georgia's numbers. So in Georgia, we have even more in the 0 to 40 year range. We have almost 2/3 of forests in Georgia less than 40 years old. And we still have less than 10% in this 80+ year old range. As you can see, we have this this quickening problem with our forests, right? We're just not letting them grow. And when they grow, they absorb carbon, and absorbing carbon is good because carbon in the atmosphere is bad. For, you know, many reasons that I will not beat you to death with, because I'm sure if you're here, you already know the basic story of climate change. But when we make our forests younger, we take away their ability to fight climate change. And the main way we make them younger is logging. So if we scale up again kind of to the whole US, and I don't have a Georgia specific fact for this, I'm sorry, but you can kind of see the colors here. 85% of our carbon emissions from our forests, so just measuring carbon flux above the forests, 85% come from logging. That's 5 times more than the carbon emissions that are coming from wildfire, insects, droughts, land use change, all those other things. It's all just logging. All of the emissions, 85%, not all of the emissions, 85% of our emissions from US forests are coming from logging, and that's a big problem. And this is not a solo researcher kind of going off the wall here. There are 2 other papers that have been published on this particular analysis showing the same sort of pattern. So let's talk briefly about the impacts of logging on climate change. First off, when we're logging at such a high rate, we have to replace those trees to a certain extent. And we do that with planting, which Ellen touched on briefly. But I call it the great replacement here because we're losing forests of natural origin. When we're planting trees, we're not planting a diverse forest. We're usually planting just one species or maybe two species, usually just one. And it's usually a pine species. It's usually slash pine or loblolly pine. And we're losing all of these other super diverse, great, mature forests. We're losing bottomland hardwoods, which are swamps, losing mixed pine hardwood, which is kind of like your core forest, elm ash cottonwood, which is kind of low-lying swampy too, longleaf pine, which you might hear in the conservation world. You know, we're losing it all and we're replacing it with plantations. And this was such a problem in the 90s that actually International Paper or Georgia Pacific, one of the major paper companies actually like made an agreement saying that they would no longer replace natural forests with plantations. But for the most part, like there are no laws on this, right? So landowners, businesses, everyone can kind of do whatever they want. The problem with it, beyond the biodiversity implications, is that planted forests store about 50% less carbon than their natural forest counterparts. And so I found this number, again, looking at that same Forest Service data that I talked about earlier with the ages of trees. And so if you just like pull out the two numbers, right? Like these are the planted forests and these are the natural forests, and they're the same forest type. If it's planted, it's estimated to store about 50% less carbon. And if you think about that on the scale that we're talking about in the South, that's a huge difference, right? So we've lost 45 million acres of, or 35 million acres of natural forests from 1950 to 2010. We've gained about 45 million acres of pine plantation in that same time period. So even though logging industry advocates, forest products advocates will say things like, oh, our forests are growing, we gained 5 million acres in 60 years. The problem is that in 1952, all of those acres were natural forests, and now a good chunk of them are plantations. In Georgia, obviously, like we're seeing this pattern all over, right? So in here, the light blue is natural stands and the dark blue is plantation style. It's clear evidence of artificial regeneration. And so you see exactly what you would expect. Lots of loblolly and shortleaf pine, a fair amount of longleaf and slash pine, and then very minimal other plantations, because planting mixed oak pine is hard to do. Planting oak and hickory is hard to do. And so now we have 31% of Georgia forests that are plantations. And again, it was 0% roughly in 1952. Okay, so off of plantations and onto fragmentation. So fragmentation is the concept that if you have like a 100-acre forest and you put a road in the middle of it, suddenly you have two 50-acre forests. That creates more edges, right? Like if you take a square and you cut it in half, then you have two rectangles, so you have two extra sides. You have a bunch of extra sides. Edge habitats are ecologically very different from like internal forest. And so fragmentation is this process that we have kind of, you know, internationally, of like carving up all of our forests into little bits and turning them all into edge habitats and basically eliminating the high quality habitats that all the cool creatures need to live and thrive and survive. And so this image that I am attempting to show you here, as I always say, green is good, red is bad. And so this is forest landscape integrity in the US South. So green is good, and that is like the Blue Ridge Mountains, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, all that. And red is bad, and you see a whole lot of red in Georgia. It's green up here because this is still the mountain range and they can't really do much to it. But all through here, this is all just, you know, cut up and not in great integrity status at all. And this down here would be the Okefenokee as well. Just making sure folks know that. So fragmentation means that forests are smaller and more vulnerable to climate change impacts. There's plenty of scientific research and studies on that. If you need sources, just let me know. All right, point number 3, biodiversity. So my general caveat, biodiversity is very expensive to measure in a meaningful way. What we know about biodiversity is limited by area, sample, or time. It's just like really hard to find people who are willing to go out for weeks on end to count all the bugs. But we do know from limited studies that the consequences of old growth forest destruction may be irreversible. We may not be able to get the same ecosystem back. Lack of deadwood means invertebrates are at risk of local extinction. If there's not enough deadwood, which Len talked about as a way to identify old growth, then the bugs that the birds need to eat are going to be at risk of local extinction. Logging has been observed to reduce marten populations for about 40 years. Martens are like weird little weasels. And logging is also to blame for local extinction events of a couple of different species, but the species that I studied during my PhD was a butterfly species, and so I named that here. So we know that logging and fragmentation are all bad for biodiversity, and we know that biodiversity is good for climate change mitigation. So losing biodiversity means losing carbon to the atmosphere too, and we have a lot of biodiversity to lose. And so these last couple of slides, I just want to showcase the amount of biodiversity that really is here in the South and in Georgia, right? So this is amphibian diversity, and we're looking at number of species. Red is actually good in this situation. I didn't make this map. If I made this map, it would be different. But all the red is the number of species, amphibian species in this area. And so you can see the same sort of like hotspot pattern in the coastal plain. And so many of these biodiversity maps, which I'm going to flip through now. So that's amphibians. Then we have reptiles all across the South, nice big red, lots of species of reptiles in the South. Fish diversity, that's not as much in Georgia, but up here with the streams, Alabama is actually weirdly the hotspot for fish diversity. I don't make up the numbers, I just report them. Tree diversity, same thing, Eastern US, and especially the South, huge numbers of endemic tree species. Bird diversity, the coastal plain, again, kind of much more restricted to the coast, but all of this, high bird numbers. Mammal diversity is the only one we kind of lose at in the Eastern US. The West gets all the points, but I threw it in there just so you know, I'm not cherry picking data here. Yeah, and so that's all our biodiversity maps, right? So like we won out of, I don't know, 8 categories. We won the biodiversity contest, and yet we are logging everything all the time, and we cannot do that anymore. Before I wrap up, I wanted to say 2 additional data points to support what other folks have said. One, about 2% of forests in the Eastern US are old growth right now. 98% don't really meet that category. But we should have much more old growth because that's going to help our climate problem. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that 1.8 million tons of wood pellets that Dr. Geer mentioned, that translates into 3.6 million tons of wood a year just to the wood pellet industry. I know a ton is kind of like an esoteric measurement for us, but 3.6 million tons sure seems like a lot. So what can we do? Climate change is obviously already happening, but Georgia and the rest of the South can help change course. And we already know the solutions, right? We need to increase energy efficiency and reduce reliance on greenhouse gas emitting fuels. Those are things we've been hearing for 20 years. The third thing we need to do, though, is the thing that we've been focusing on here, which is preserving more natural landscapes and prevent logging, thinning, and heavy manipulations. We can't just slap a sign on a newly protected land and then continually go in there and log everything. That is not the way forward, and that's not the way to make our trees and our forests older. And so we really focus on, you may hear us say protect, but I like to use preserve because we do need that higher standard. Basically, we can't let dirty industries get away with killing our forests and our planet. So this is my last slide. We'll go into Q&A. I have our Act Now page if you would like to be a part of what Dogwood is doing. We talked a lot about forests here, but we do also do a lot of work with community members across the South. Do a lot on forest climate change, bioenergy, conservation, community solutions, all those things. So yeah, and then we have our emails here as well, which you will be able to email us whenever you desire.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we are going to move into the Q&A session here, or section. So if you've got questions for the for any of the three of us, feel free to use that question and answer section down in the bottom. One person asked, will the slides be available for us after the webinar? We'll share a recording of the webinar, and then if you want copies of particular slides, you can go ahead and email the panelists and we can probably get you those particular things. So I'm going to take advantage of the fact that no one's asked a question yet to say to ask about burning wood pellets and biomass. I think this is something that governments, you know, I think both overseas and in our country like to try to put into the category of renewable energy, because, you know, it's, I suppose, more renewable than oil. But, you know, we at Environment America, Environment Georgia, when we talk about clean renewable energy, we're usually talking about solar, wind, and geothermal. Can one of you, yeah, I don't know, sort of speak to that, you know, that misconception, and, you know, what do you think we can be doing to get biomass out of the renewable category?
I'm happy to, although Truva, feel free to do that. So yes, bioenergy is technically a renewable energy, right? Like we burn it, we can grow more. The problem with bioenergy is that it is a high carbon renewable energy. When we burn biomass, we are emitting about 50% more carbon dioxide than coal at the smokestack. And the only reason that governments have jumped on the well, there's a bunch of reasons. One of the reasons that countries have jumped on this biomass train is that they look at the landscape level of carbon growth and they say, well, as long as we're growing more than we burn, it's fine. But that really shouldn't be our standard. Like that bare minimum of sustainability should not be our standard in a time when we're trying to draw down the most amount of carbon possible. The other reason functionally that governments have jumped on the biomass train is because it is relatively easy to make a few changes at the coal burning plants to co-fire. So very often these plants that are burning bioenergy are not only burning wood pellets, they're burning wood pellets mixed in with coal, which creates kind of this third category that's worse than coal, but that's where they're at. So we also, when we talk about renewables, we kind of talk about the true good renewables, which are wind and solar and geothermal and hydro, of course, recognizing that each of them have their own challenges and no energy is truly clean and perfect for the communities that have to deal with generation and production.
Thanks. Okay, so question from the audience. How do we stop logging of private forests? What legal tools are available? And then I might expand that to just say what tools are available.
Well, I'll start and then I'll let Dr. Davis add on any additional, because this is something we talk about often, is conservation. What does the conservation plans look like? What will help private landowners keep their forests? We know that gets to be a very sticky spot when you have someone who has a forest or has trees on their property and they're like, hey, there's a logger that comes by, there's a company that wants to buy it, and they're trying to send their kid to school. So they're thinking, okay, we'll get rid of these trees, or we have bills to pay. So there's going to have to be some state level policy and some different conservation and maybe even federal with our conservation policies to help them keep those trees, but also put some money in their pocket. I don't know exactly what that looks like. I know Dr. Davis has done lots of work on this, because that's the next level of the solution is these private landowners. They can stop selling their trees. We can keep those old growth forests and sequester the carbon that we need. So Dr. Davis, I'm gonna pass it on over to you to talk about that further.
Yeah, I mean, I saw who the question came from. Hi, Will. We've talked at least over email. You know, unfortunately in the US, like, if your neighbor is cutting trees and you don't want them to, you have one option, right? It's to buy the land from them and prevent the sale. And that's not always feasible because neighbors are jerks and sometimes they just want to do what they want to do with their land. And also, like, the money is good when you log a forest, even if it's only 10 acres, you know, you're getting hundreds to a couple thousand per acre, depending on what you have. And that's like a good paycheck. I'm not gonna lie. What we can do is kind of what Dr. Gear was talking about. We can incentivize. And so we can try to draw people away from it. And we know that this could work because most landowners, when you ask them, like, why do you own your land? They're naming things like heritage, having a place to recreate, having a place to fish, a little bit of an income source because, you know, they rent out for deer hunters. So most people don't want an ugly clear cut on the land that they own. It's just that these procurement loggers come in and they're like, I'll give you $30,000 if you let me destroy your forest. And $30,000 or $50,000 or however much, it's a lot of money for, you know, a struggling middle working class that happens to have like land passed down for generations. So it's really challenging, and we have to look at ways that we can invest in private landowners and shift the conversation away from like these kind of lower quality uses of wood to, like, I'm not anti furniture. I like having tables. I'm maybe anti like paper cups at Starbucks that you throw away all the time, or anti napkins, and I'm definitely anti wood pellets. I guess not to belabor the point, but just to finish, there are different prices for wood for those things, right? Like the best quality wood that you're going to get, the best price is for wood that they can use for furniture. The landowners that are selling for pellets are getting like pennies on the dollar compared to what people are getting for an acre of furniture wood instead. And so they're also kind of getting screwed there when they're selling off their wood for pellets or paper compared to other uses. So yeah, so unfortunately complex topic.
Right. I'll say one thing on the federal level, with a set of bills that have passed recently in Congress, the USDA Forest Service has a lot more money than they sometimes have that's meant to be used for, you know, climate mitigation efforts and other you know, other kind of programs and initiatives. And so, you know, it's not quite as simple as they just pay off the landowners, but it also is not that complicated. You know, we know that keeping our old trees standing is a you know, a big piece of the climate solution. And so, you know, the federal government, you know, could and should be actually, you know, incentivizing doing conservation easements, making it actually more lucrative for private landowners to keep the trees standing on their property than to you know, than to sell to sell them. And that's currently not the case. So all right, so then we've got oh, this is a fun question. I'm bouncing around a little bit. I work for, this is a question from the audience. I work for a company that is the largest landowner in Georgia. How can I influence them to save our forests? Someone want to take a crack at that?
Well, I'll start. It depends on what they're doing with that forest, because right now it's sad that when they see green, which is the trees, they see another type of green too. It's like dollar bills all over the place. It just depends on what they're doing with it. If not, you know, you maybe start a conversation with them if there's a community group, another organization, so you can kind of spearhead them before they start cutting that forest. And I guess that's another question. Are they already using that forest for for logging and things like that? Because that is a complex conversation, helping them find ways that it can be more beneficial to the community. And I think it would help having a proactive conversation before they're already about to do something and there's some type of economic development plan in place, like a huge data center that's about to come to Georgia and cut down about 600 acres if it's put in place in Fayetteville, Georgia. Now that's going to be an issue as well. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, the best way to influence the company that you work for is, to start talking with them and talk about the values. And I mean, depending on the type of company, you can kind of go two ways, right? You can try to convince them that they can get a like PR opportunity if they actually conserve the forest and do something like a forest carbon program. And they can also make a little bit of money with forest carbon offsets. It's not going to be the same rate of return as harvesting the land, though. So, they're kind of paying for the PR in that way. And then the other strategy you can go is, well, I don't know what kind of company it is, but if the company holding of forest land is kind of adjacent to their purpose, you could encourage them to sell it off for conservation easements or something like that. But it is generally very, very challenging to, be an activist in a company. And I'd be happy to follow up with you specifically if you wanted more information or assistance or wanted us to like prep fact sheets to help you or something like that.
Because I'll have to add this too, because Dr. Davis also with the Inflation Reduction Act and different grants that these nonprofits have, they could actually be eligible for some of those funds to actually do something with that forest, save that forest, do some education on that forest. And actually, it could actually benefit that company even more so, and get some tax breaks for sure.
Absolutely. All right. So then next question, this was, how is Environment Georgia addressing the loss of forest in Georgia? What policies are you advocating for? So I'll answer that and then I'll pass to you folks to say what policies Dogwood Alliance is advocating for as well. So the Environment Georgia and the Environment America Network are really, really focused on this, pushing the Biden administration, so the Department of Interior and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to do a national rulemaking, which would result in a rule, which a rule is would be a durable binding, regulation that would protect mature and old growth on federal forest land. So, that doesn't deal with state forest land. It obviously doesn't deal with private forest land. But if you look at the, forest land in the United States, the federal government, controls and manages a huge amount of acreage. And if we can get the federal government to, change their approach, stop the logging of old and mature trees, leave those standing, that would make a huge difference to to forests in all but there's a couple states that don't have any national forests at all, but most of them do. And then our next step after that will be then focusing on similar efforts at the state level. But right now we're very, very focused on building support to convince the Biden administration to to take this action federally. And then the question was, what can we do as individuals to support your efforts? I'll drop our petition into the chat for folks as well, and then turn it over to if either of you wants to take the what policies are you all currently advocating for question.
We've signed on a similar efforts as yours with preserving the mature forest, but also we've also reached out to the USDA. We've, talked with at the federal level, but the USDA about changing their terminology. You can't save the forest and say that it's a mature growth forest like the statement you use, but then say it's a renewable source. we're going to have to start thinking about trees like fossil fuels. It's going to take a long time to get a good old tree. And that's not in the time that we're taking them down. We're taking them down at a faster rate, as Dr. Davis said, as we can put them back up. So what that leaves us with is a whole lot of immature trees, pine plantations, because now they're even harvesting the straw underneath those pine plantations. So you're not just robbing it of its biodiversity. So we're asking them to change their language at the state level. One thing is the Okefenokee. I'm glad you mentioned Okefenokee, Dr. Davis, earlier, because that's one of our oldest blackwater swamps. And it is so diverse. It has a wealth of animal species, plant species. It's critical to our clean water. And so there was some legislation that was passed through, that was pushed through. It did not pass to give state protection and final protection to the Okefenokee. So it was not, because it constantly comes under the threat of mining. That's still something that's in question. So those are some of the things that we're pushing for at Dogwood.
I do too, just want to, like, the forest historian in me wants to say that the Forest Service came about in the 1920s as a result of that 3-map series that I showed you, right? So we cut all our trees down, and then we realized that we didn't have any trees left. And the Forest Service came into being to, make our resources sustainable, right? So initially they were not conservation, and that's not necessarily in their like mission, but that's not a reason that we can't change that, and that's not a reason that we can't continue to push on them. And we see something like the Fish and Wildlife Service and their federal lands, their mission is more inclusive of biodiversity, and even though it doesn't explicitly say it, like carbon storage. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service has been a little bit more of an ally in this fight than I'd say the USDA or the Forest Service have been, but they can certainly change.
Yeah, and that is a note. People may have been wondering why is the U.S. Forest Service in the U.S. Department of Agriculture as opposed to the Department of the Interior, which is where most of our National Park Service and all of that. And it's because the forest land, that's cropland, right? The one of the big missions of the Forest Service is to do timber sales. And again, as Dr. Davis says, that doesn't mean we can't push to change that, but we're looking at a more than a century of momentum pushing the other way there. So I think we've got time for one more question. We've got one more. So could the federal government or carbon offset industry ever afford to buy the carbon rights to private forests that could compete with industrial logging? I do not know the answer to that. It's an interesting idea, though.
I mean, pure market value, probably not. But you have to remember that, so like there was those pay what you want study. I'm going all over the place tonight, but hang with me, I will get to the point. So those like pay what you want services, like you find an ebook you want and you go through the checkout and it's like, pay what you want, pay nothing, pay $5, I don't care, just give me what you feel like it's worth. So there's actually a study done on that versus a fixed price versus doing a pay what you want with the understanding that a portion was going to a nonprofit. And what they found was when you had a pay what you want system and an explicit acknowledgement that a portion of the money was going to charity, people paid more and gave more. And so I think when we're thinking about carbon pricing, we have to acknowledge that, right? Like, we're not just getting the market value, cash for cash, right? People are human, they want to do good. They want to be invested, and so many landowners are invested in the quality of their land and the relationship that they have with their land. And so I don't actually think that we need to pay full on forestry market value for these forests. We just have to pay enough where they can pay their taxes, feel good about what they're doing, and maybe have a little bit extra to go out to dinner to celebrate. Maybe a little more. I don't know. I don't know what the market can bear. So I don't have a specific price, but I would just say, I think it's about more than market value in this case when we're talking about forest carbon. And also, like, some landowners too are still iffy about the whole climate change carbon thing. And so we can also think about strategies to talk about the values of forest without necessarily bringing in something that might feel overly politicized. And we can talk about like the flood risks, benefits, the biodiversity, the clean water that you get from your well, all those other benefits that forests provide. So I hope that was helpful. Feel free to add in, folks.
No, although I see in the chat, Dr. Gear, you mentioned that you advocate in the UK as well to fight the subsidies. So can you just maybe a minute on on what
Yes.
that looks like?
Yes, the companies there, working with keeping an eye on the parliament and partners in the UK, working with them to write, actions and things like that to actually compel them, their parliament to stop these subsidies, because that's one of the biggest engines for capital for these companies. They're getting these large subsidies. They're coming here, robbing our land of the trees here in the US, and then taking them back as pellets. In the meantime, they're polluting our people that live in those communities by these pellet plants and causing a bunch of waste here, taking our trees, going over there, getting these large subsidies, and then sometimes getting tax breaks in our own country. So that's another thing to work on. And yeah, so we're pushing back on that. And so we keep our ear to the ground and are constantly focused on that. One of our colleagues actually works solely with the UK and some of the legislation that goes on over there. So we always have our eye on that and what's going on in the United States.
And an excellent reminder that this is a global problem on on so many different levels. I think we're at time. So thank you so much, everybody. Please feel free to reach out to any of us if you've got follow-up questions. We'll also send out a link to, I just put my email address in the chat. I will also send out a link to the video of this presentation. It'll be available on Facebook and on YouTube. So and again, feel free to reach out, and thank you all so much for coming.